Okay. Good morning and good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's Luohan Academy's webinar. My name is Luohan, and I'll be your host today. We'll cover a topic that may profoundly impact our lives. Is privacy, and the session will last about an hour, and including a Q&A session in the end. So privacy is a fundamental aspect of our lives, but it's constantly evolving in the face of rapid technological advancement, data-driven economies, and shifting societal norms. But today we are honored to have one of the leading experts in the world on the intersection of privacy, technology, and economics to guide us through this complex and fascinating topic. It's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Alessandro Acquisti. Professor Acquisti is a renowned researcher, author, and thought leader in the fields of privacy, behavioral economics, and information technology. She serves as the trustees professor of information technology and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University's Heinz College. Professor Acquisti is also a director of the Privacy Economics Experiments Lab. He has tested before the U.S. Senate and House committees and has consulted on issues related to privacy policy and consumer behavior with numerous agencies and organizations, including the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, and the European Commission. In today's talk, The Economics of Privacy and Crossroads, Professor Acquisti will show us the evolving landscape of privacy economics. Professor Acquisti, it's an honor to have you with us again. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Good morning, and good afternoon, good evening. Is actually my pleasure. Thank you for having me again here. I was asked to do something slightly different today, rather than presenting a new manuscript, a new study. I was asked to cover the materials I focus on in a recent piece for the NBER, the title of which is the title of today's presentation, The Economics of Privacy at the Crossroads. Essentially, this is a critical reassessment of very personal reassessment. You will see that the views are very much my own views on the state of the field that I've been part of for over 20 years. And in although I've been part of this field, the economics of privacy, for about 20 years, is as a even more prestigious pedigree and even lengthier existence, because actually the field started in the 1980s with Chicago school scholars such as Stiglitz and Posner. Back then, there were very few economists, although top economists, working on privacy. And in the space of just over 40 years, the field has truly exploded, so much so that it has entered mainstream today. Entering mainstream in the sense that economic mainstream, for instance, I was lucky to have to co-author with Leah Wagman and Curtis Taylor a review on in the Journal of Economic Literature in 2016. Few years ago, Avi Goldfarb and Catherine Tucker hosted two events at NPR. First, a workshop for PhD students on economics of privacy, then a workshop for scholars, which then led to an edited volume where I ended up publishing the chapter that is the focus of my talk today. Also, policy mainstream. In the last 10 years in particular, although privacy regulation has existed for a very long time, in the last 10 years in particular, there have been important regulatory interventions which have attracted the attention of economists and have generated a significant amount of empirical work. The GDPR in particular, but also the California Consumer Privacy Act. You see more often policymakers discussing concepts which would have been utterly alien just 20 years ago, such as data dividends, giving back to data creators, which are us, the data subjects, the users, the consumers, giving back some of the wealth we are clearly creating through our data, and which is then used in a number of different ways in the online ad economy. The Federal Trade Commission a few years ago had a rulemaking on what they call the commercial surveillance. They requested comments. If you read carefully the rulemaking, there are plenty of references to the economic value of data, the economic value of privacy. And if you look at the thousands of comments that have been left on the rulemaking on the website, they are publicly available, you see the debate around the value of privacy, the value of data. So I believe it's a very good moment to try to take a brief stop and take stock of the situation and try to assess what we believe we know now that perhaps we didn't know in 1980s when the field started, and what we believe as a field, as a group of economists, we got right, and what we believe, or perhaps I should clarify what I personally believe we got wrong. So where is the economics of privacy failing? And this is in essence the goal of this volume and this chapter in the volume, and what I'm going to discuss today. So I have to start with a little bit of history. Believe me, I will be short. This is not an economic history presentation, but I believe some history is very, very important because it helps contextualize what the economics of privacy, in my view, what the economics of privacy, what it got right and what it got wrong. So the economics of privacy, as I mentioned, is not new. It started in late 70s, early 80s with Chicago School scholars, as I mentioned, such as Posner and Stigler, so giants of the economics literature and specifically the law of economics. In particular, Richard Posner in 1981 published in AER a short piece, but highly influential. In the very first page of that piece, Richard Posner makes three significant claims. In a number of different things. One that Posner believes should be of concern to economists is privacy as concealment of information, right? Privacy as protection information. The second claim is that using as an example, the labor market, where perhaps an employee may be deficient in some traits and may not want the employer or potential future employer to know about this deficiency, then this concealment of information is more specifically concealment of negative information. So the employee in this context doesn't want the employer to know something which is negative. So privacy being about having something to hide. If because of privacy regulation, laws, technology, or norm, if for any of these reasons the employer cannot find out this deficiency in the employee, there are essentially economic frictions. There is less efficiency. In this case, less efficiency in the labor market because there is no good matching. But you can extrapolate and project this example out to any other scenario on advertising, and essentially any other scenario where. Now, keep this in mind because I'm going to go back to it. So in the 1980s, like I said, the debate was essentially dominated by Chicago School scholar. Although, as you will see by the end of the talk, scholars such as Posner and Stigler were actually not the only ones in the space, and their view actually did not go unchallenged. If the name Jack Hirschleifer tells you something, and I hope it does, you will see how his relevance will become stronger and stronger through my talk, ending up with a quote from him at the very end of my presentation. And then there was a period of silence, because between the mid-80s and mid-90s, I didn't find much literature by economics on privacy. not much at all. And then in the mid-1990s, there is an explosion. And scholars such as Kenneth Loudon, who I believe at the time was at NYU, Eli Noam, who I believe at the time was at Columbia, Hal Varian, who was transitioning between Michigan and Berkeley, where he ended up being the dean. And by the way, for full disclosure, Hal, I was lucky enough to have Hal as my PhD advisor. This economy started reinventing the field by actually going deeper. And a little bit farther than the somewhat monotonic Chicago view of privacy as a concealment of essentially something. Kenneth Loudon is significant because he was the very first economist, to my knowledge, to propose markets for personal data. Essentially, markets, as I believe he called them in a 1996 piece on the communications of the ACM, markets for privacy. The idea was warehouses, data warehouses, where the consumer could kind of store digitally the personal information. And if companies wanted to access this information, they would have to pay some monetary reward to the user. So this idea of propertization of personal information and property rights over data and compensating the consumer for usage of their data, as you can see, is not novel. Has been existing essentially for now over 30 years. I believe an interesting Q&A discussion at the end of this talk could be why we don't have those markets yet. To clarify my comment, we have plenty of data markets. We have plenty of personal data markets. Every time we go online, our data is being collected, merged, analyzed, transacted, bought and sold. What we don't have is something like Loudon envision, something where consumers can explicitly buy and sell rights over their data. We have indirect transactions. Every time you use Google search engine or Facebook, you are essentially selling data and buying a service, but that's an implicit transaction. We don't have something like Loudon proposed, even though many startups have tried to do so. So interesting point we can go back to that later. Eli Noam was one of the very first one to connect another Chicago scholar, Coase, and his so-called theorem to privacy, and to point out that even in absence of privacy regulation, or rather independently of whether privacy regulation exists or does not exist, it will be the market which will decide whether data is protected or not based on the relative valuations that data subjects give to the protection of their data or potential data holders give to obtaining the data. In essence, if you value your privacy more than, say, Amazon can benefit from your data, even in absence of privacy regulation, you will negotiate with Amazon privacy rights. And you will be willing to pay a little bit more to Amazon in order to have privacy so that Amazon doesn't use your data in ways you don't want, doesn't share your data with third parties, et cetera, et cetera. Or vice versa, if Amazon values your data more than you value your privacy, even if there is privacy regulation protecting you, Amazon can still offer you a contract telling you, Alessandro, I know that GDPR protects you, but you know what? I would like to offer you $5 per month to use your data. And Eli Noam, being a very smart scholar, added that, well, we know that things fail where there are significant transactional costs, and when an individual may not be able, we know that the Coase theorem breaks down when there are significant transactional costs or when the economic agents cannot assign a value to the assets. And that happens exactly in the case of privacy. In the case of privacy, there are significant transaction costs for data subjects to negotiate with data holders. More often than not, there is a lack of external privacy choices for consumers. And also it's very difficult for consumers to pinpoint a correct valuations of their data. And this perhaps may explain why ultimately this debate becomes very relevant to whether or not from an economic perspective, privacy regulation makes sense. I'm going to go back to this point. And then Varian, sorry. He pointed out that while Posner and Stigler were looking at privacy as something to hide, things are actually more nuanced than that, because the consumer may A rational consumer may want some information about them to be known by others. For instance, what their interests are, whether they want to go to a vacation in Cancun. Because that way, telemarketers will only call consumers for ads, for offers related to things the consumers are interested in. Varian, as I mentioned, wrote in the mid-1990s. So at the time, the key problem was telemarketers, people calling you at night or at dinner time with some offers. Simultaneously, the consumer may not want the telemarketer to know the consumer preference too well, because if the telemarketer knows the consumer preferences very well, they can estimate the reservation price of the consumer. And if they can estimate the reservation price, the telemarketer will be able to make an offer for a vacation to Cancun, which the consumer wants, but selling it at a price which is equal to the reservation price. And therefore, the telemarketer will get the entire surplus from the transaction. So there was already in Varian an evolution in nuance relative to the original Chicago view. And what is utterly interesting to me is how, although Varian was writing, as I said, in the mid-1990s, referring to telemarketing, essentially everything he says can be applied today to online behavior advertising. And then after 2000, there was an explosion of theoretical empirical research. Really, in the last 20 years, in 20, 25 years, the field has absolutely exploded. There is so much research coming out now every week. Notwithstanding the fact that the field has increased, almost exploded, I believe, and this is my personal view, that the field is still very heavily influenced by the early 1980s views of privacy. So yes, we have become more nuanced. Yes, we have become more sophisticated, both in approaching privacy and also in our empirical methodologies to study privacy trade-offs. And yet there is still in the DNA of us privacy economists something directly linkable to Chicago School views. And I try to summarize it in this table, in which I contrast what pure privacy scholars. By pure privacy scholars, I mean people who, academically speaking, only work on privacy. So I try to contrast pure privacy scholars think of privacy, how they think of privacy, to how economists who work in privacy think of privacy. And of course, I have to clarify, there will be some generalization, okay? So not all economists think that way. Also, not all privacy scholars think that way. But by and large, in economics, we still often look at privacy as concealment. I still see many papers defining privacy as concealment, as protection information, essentially equating privacy as with the removal of information. Thankfully, this does not happen all the time. There are scholars who use a different definition of privacy, such as control of personal information, which is a definition dating back to Alan Westin, a non-privacy scholar, was extremely influential through his scholarship. But very few economists, however, embrace what I personally find the most compelling definition of privacy, which is the one by Erwin Altman, an American social psychologist, which looks at privacy as a process of boundary regulation. Now, this is not just semantic. I'm not a linguist. I'm not trying to make just a purely academic distinction between words. I'm making a distinction which is absolutely crucial, I argue, to understand the implication of privacy. And my argument is that because many of us in the field still look at privacy like this, we end up not fully understanding the very economic implications of privacy in our modern society. We end up not fully understanding the way consumers act when it comes to privacy. And therefore, we end up making conclusions about the opportunity or the supposed inefficiency of privacy regulations or regulatory intervention, which are very different from the conclusions that non-economics privacy scholars reach. So what is this boundary regulation? Why does it have such a profound impact on how we can think of even the economics of privacy? The boundary regulation is for Altman a dialectic and dynamic process of sharing and protecting. Essentially, for Altman, we are constantly negotiating in our daily life these boundaries of public and private. When I go out with a friend and I share a secret, I go out for drinks with a friend and I share a secret with that friend, I am engaging in privacy behavior. So the act of disclosure is a privacy behavior. Disclosing my secret is a privacy behavior because I'm choosing this friend and this friend only to share something which is bothering me, right? The moment that friend, however, goes home and posts on Facebook, hey, I've been out with Alessandro tonight, and Alessandro told me such and such, that's the moment when my trust is being broken, my privacy is being violated because the regulation, the boundary has been broken. Okay, so this is why Altman refers to privacy as dialectic and dynamic, because there is both the act of opening and closing. The opening and closing of the self to others, they are both privacy behaviors. But the key is that privacy is maintained when this opening and closing happens according to the will of the subject. If it happens based on the will of a third party, such as a data platform or government or friend declaring privacy, then that's a moment where privacy is broken. And by the way, Altman also said that we engage in these behaviors constantly without even realizing that we are doing so. I'm going to go back to this point in the further on this cycle, because again, it's quite important to understand privacy, consumer behavior, privacy evaluations of consumers, and the so-called privacy paradox, the infamous privacy paradox, on which so much literature has been written. Economists tend to think of privacy as personal information, which is natural. The vast majority of studies.
Yeah, may I ask a question? Yeah, because the first difference actually interests me, because can I understand in this way? So if we translate the privacy as boundary regulation into kind of economic modeling language, can we say we should model privacy as some the control of the decision making over sharing a piece of information or not as the choice variable, instead of saying whether share or not as the choice variable?
It would be a good approximation with an importance, with an emphasis put on the contextuality and the dynamic element of this. So rather than static concealment, there is a dynamic element in Altman's definition, which allows for the same individual who want sharing or want not sharing of the same piece of information depending on context. So it's a very fluid approach. So you could put it as control of information, but that would be you would be going the right direction, but it would not fully capture.
Is there any existing studies trying to model in this way? Because as far as I know,
so in economics, this is not common. There have been work, there has been work such as the work by Sandra Petronio, who has somewhat formalized boundary regulation in her theory of, if I remember correctly, communication privacy management, CPM, if I remember correctly. I hope I'm not getting this wrong. And she has formalized this as a model, but she's a communication researcher, not an economist.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So privacy personal information, whereas for many privacy scholars, privacy is much more.
Sorry, Alexandra. May I continue with the question? So do you think this different definition will have impact on the conclusions? Or put differently, so I'm interested to see how you think the achievement of the economics literature, but then if we couldn't even agree on the definition, how can we generate models? How can we generate conclusion? Does it make a material difference?
Yes, so thank you for the question. I believe it does, and I believe that I will try to show this in essentially through the rest of the slides. So I would love for you to tell me by the time I've reached the the middle or even the end of the presentation what you think about this, because that's exactly my point. So I'm trying to demonstrate how these seemingly purely definitional differences end up having very huge consequences. Okay, so privacy is not just personal information. It's in fact also about decision autonomy, freedom, liberty, dignity. So in economies, if they narrowly define privacy as concealment specifically of personal information, even more specifically of negative information, would use reveal preference arguments and will look at the fact that everyone is on Facebook and or Twitter or TikTok. People use Instagram to post intimate photos. People have become accustomed to share all this sensitive information about themselves online to conclude, you know what, people don't care that much about privacy. And this is often proposed as an explanation for the privacy paradox. The privacy paradox, I don't need to explain what it is. I know some of you in this room have even worked on that. But in essence, one possible explanation is that, you know, people say they care about privacy, but they actually, in reality, they don't care that much. And this is revealed in the choices in the market. In contrast, there is a very different way to look at the empirical evidence coming from the paradox, which is very much consistent with Altman's view of brand boundary regulation. Under that view, the usage of Facebook, the usage of Instagram, the usage of disclosure technologies is not a privacy-defying action. It can be, but it is not necessarily, because under this more holistic and dynamic view of privacy, individuals simultaneously want to open and to close the self to others, depending on context. So again, people may be, the very notion of privacy in public, right, is very common in Altman's literature, and happens online as well. And we have plenty of evidence of privacy interested individuals, privacy sensitive individuals, actually making use of social media and trying to engage in privacy in public. So, for instance, they may be on Facebook because all their peers are on Facebook, and therefore they need to be on Facebook in order to interact. But they try to choose privacy settings in a way to carve out a private space out of this public environment. Or perhaps they may switch to a new social network, which they see as not connected to Facebook, and therefore perhaps more private, such as, say, Instagram. But then, of course, Instagram gets bought by Facebook. So you see how the challenge arises in translating privacy desires into privacy actions in the marketplace. The challenges arise because it is extremely costly for consumers to manage their privacy. Going back to Altman, I told you that Altman claimed that privacy behaviors are ubiquitous and instinctual. For instance, we may be with a group of friends over a coffee in the afternoon, and we see a call, and the call is from our doctor office because we did a pretty important medical test a few days prior. And we instinctively decide to leave the group of friends to take that call, not just because we want to hear the doctor well, but also because we know that we're about to discuss something which is sensitive and private. That is an instinctual reaction. And Altman essentially claimed that we do that all the time. We don't even realize when we are doing it. For instance, right now, many almost all of us on this call have their videos off. And there could be multiple reasons for having their cameras off. It could be to respect the speaker, so to put more attention on the speaker. It could also be to shield your privacy of your room and not showing the view of your room with others. So essentially, Altman believed that these behaviors are ubiquitous. And but when we go online, this is where the problems happen, because while in the offline world we have developed these instincts to manage our privacy because we detect the presence of others. online, we often lack the sensorial cues to even realize when our privacy is being violated. If I am in a group of friends and I see the call from the doctor, I sense the group of friends, I naturally react to that boundary, and I try to recreate some private space by moving elsewhere. When I am online and I get a message from the doctor's office, I don't realize, because I don't have the same visual cues, I don't realize that actually that message maybe is being monitored by my ISP, maybe by Google, maybe by the NSA, maybe by whoever else. So we literally lack those cues that allow people to navigate this boundary, this Altmanian boundary. That's why people may care a lot for privacy, but may be at a disadvantage, especially in our online society, to manage the privacy. The costs of privacy management are much higher, I would argue, online than offline. And because of this, by the way, I have several other slides about the privacy paradox. Ask me in the Q&A. I will not go deep into that because I want to focus more on the econ rather than behavior econ. But if you want, ask me questions later in the Q&A. Because of all this, I argue, that's my personal view, okay, that in general, economists tend to be skeptical about government intervention in privacy. And if you look at the empirical literature on privacy, there has been a significant focus on the cost of privacy regulation, especially after the enactment of the GDPR. There have been lots of studies trying to focus on the cost of GDPR. And it makes sense if you take this view of privacy. If you take this view of privacy, you actually put a little bit more emphasis on the fact that people do care. They face hurdles in protecting privacy online. And privacy is really important because it's not just personal information, it's autonomy, it's freedom, it's dignity. And therefore, perhaps we should actually give regulation a chance because it is such an important value, which is so hard to maintain. Okay, so this is once again, I do admit that this is a simplification because we have also contrarian views on either side of these columns. So where are we now? I believe that please.
Yes, Alexandra. So I have two questions. I'm trying to get, if you go back to the last slide, I'm trying to see where are we getting from this. I'm comparing the two sides. It seems to me that economists tend to be slightly narrow-minded, but if we somehow think that information, private or just personal information, whatever it is, it has utilities more than just money or other stuff, like somehow they feel it's related to their dignity or pride or whatever it is, then that seems to be, we can reconcile both sides. So if we think about, it is a trade-off, firstly, and if wherever we think it's trade-off, essentially it's like that dynamic you're talking about on the right-hand side. Then also if it contains several utilities, not just money or other stuff, that seems to be consistent on both sides. Am I correct in understanding this?
Sorry,
in the beginning,
what is the question? If you can be so kind to repeat the question.
The question is, are economists missing the point or not? But after you listing out these things, I'm thinking that if we can think about privacy as information kind of trade-off, but the trade-off is a little bit complicated because this revealing of or concealing of this information has several aspects of utilities. If we can think that way,
okay.
Then
so if we expand, thank you. If we expand our views of trade-offs to be more encompassing and to account for things like this, is that what you're saying?
Then it seems to be they can be compatible to each other.
Yes, they may be closer to compatible. And indeed, I'm going to go back to that point as well. So,
cool.
So thank you. Yes, it goes in the direction. Thank you so much. And then I saw Ginger and then Lian. Oh, sorry.
I have
did you have more? Please.
Sorry. Yes, I have a question. So in the previous several of our dialogues at the Luohan Academy, several of the European economists like the Chris Psaridas and even Ben Holmstrom. They're both from Europe, as you know, and they were kind of pessimistic about the progress of the digital stuff economy in Europe. And they were, as Chris once directly mentioned, that GDPR is just a failure. Do you agree?
No, I do not. I believe that and I'm going to back exactly to that in a few slides. So sorry, I keep, but I promise I have something very specifically related to the GDPR. It's not a failure. To be clear, it's not an economic failure. It may be perhaps a privacy failure in that it is unclear the extent to which it has truly protect EU residents' privacy. But my view, which is probably a minoritarian view among economists, I have to disclose, is that the economic cost of GDPR, I think, have been vastly overblown. And this seems like a strong claim, and therefore I'm going to support it empirically in a few slides.
Okay.
Thank you. Ginger.
Hi, Alexandra. It's very interesting that you're. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I was simply saying, yeah, hi, sorry.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you're contrasting those two views. It seems like the privacy scholarship emphasized a lot on dynamics and maybe behavioral economics, both of which have been developed in economics and could be incorporated in economics. So I'm wondering whether just adding those elements actually would make the two sides compatible with each other.
Wouldn't make, yeah, it's a great point, right? And once again, I'm going to go back exactly to the point, because I think it's a very subtle, very important point. Perhaps there is a reason why economics studies the economic trade-offs, and we should not, as economists, touch on things like freedom, liberty, etc., because they are super important, but they are not easily quantifiable assets or values. So I think it's a super important point. I promise you, once again, I said this now 3 times, I'm going to back exactly to the point, because there is something very relevant that I have to say about that. So, and this will probably in just maybe 4 or 5 slides. Thank you, Ginger. I promise I'll go back. Liam.
Thank you, Alexander. So my question might be related to Long's question. So when we talk about the regulation, it's for us at economics, it's necessary to think about the welfare, to think about how to model privacy in your preference. And I think at least 3 ways we think about that. I think in a sense, privacy is similar to money. So directly you can think about the money in utility. You can also think about the privacy in utility. So that's more like a very intrinsic. You just care about the utility itself. So this is the one dimension. The other dimension, like this information perspective, I care about this privacy because my information might be revealed. So some other people, like how Varian said, it might press discriminate me. That's about the dollar, about the money. And now going back to the first one, the privacy and utility part, there I think even have 2 dimensions. One, you care about this privacy being known by other people, this action per se. This is more like as long as other people know this thing is bad to me. Another dimension is it's a social thing. It's about how the economy, how the society think about me, right? So something maybe people think the privacy is bad. Sometimes it might be good. It might be a way of showing off. It's telling other people this is really good to me. The value is cost is right. It's the benefit or the intensity is really depend on the common belief. It's more like a general equilibrium thing. How other people think about this thing is some sentiment or some soft spots or this kind of thing. The general equilibrium element that will it's not derived from the first primitive. It's just something in my utility. It's also an equilibrium element. So this is kind of three-dimensional think about that. It's I don't know. So what's your view on this? When we think about the welfare, the GDPR, all these kind of things, how should we think about this nowadays? When people write down models like in the economic growth model, people just put the privacy as a utility, money utility. It's just calibrate some parameter, and I don't know how exactly quantify that. So I want to see your view. This is like a very broad question. Yeah.
Incredibly important point. Thank you. All of your questions from all of you so far are so stimulating, so interesting, so important. And Leon, yeah, the distinction. So you brought three distinctions, but two of them were already being offered by economist Joe Farrell, Berkeley. At the time, actually, was chief economist at the FTC. In a paper titled "Is Privacy Just Any Other Economic Good?" or somewhat something along those lines. Essentially, he used the IO distinction between intermediate and final goods, and pointed out that privacy can be both an intermediate and a final good, which is a different wording to talk about what you are referring to, which is something that also scholars such as Tessari have been referring to, the instrumental value of privacy and the intrinsic value of privacy. Definitely, this complicates a lot things, because it's in some cases I may desire privacy for to literally protect myself from price discrimination. So I can quantify what the damage, economic damage to me would be if my willingness to pay for the vacation to Cancun is obtained by the seller, because I can estimate that in that case, the seller will extract all the surplus from the transaction and I will have zero net utility from the transaction. So that's a quantification is possible, perhaps, but there are also the element of just desiring privacy, not because you can quantify a specific risk or trade-off arising from your loss of privacy, but just because you don't like it, right? So this complicates enormously things. I believe that Tessari empirical work in trying to disentangle them was brilliant, was extremely interesting. How to use it for public policy? Well, that's tricky, right? Because should we just drive public policy simply based on the quantifiable risk of privacy and following? I'm not saying that Ginger claimed this, by the way, so I'm not putting words in Ginger's mouth, but following the analysis that economists should do what economists are good at, only focus on trade-offs, or should we in public policy account for these other dimensions of privacy that people cannot assign a price to? They are not an intermediate tool to protect directly from direct costs and benefits, but they are nevertheless important. So I don't have an answer. I think that, empirically speaking, Tessari has done great work. I don't have an answer from the policy perspective, other than the one I'm about to give in a few slides. So I promised several times that I wanted to show you something. Let me get to that. Essentially, let me get to that. So essentially what I'm saying is that I believe that, to summarize where we are, the field has grown a lot, especially in the last 10 years. I believe that it is robust to say that the trade-offs are context dependent, rather than privacy being always inherently welfare decreasing. And there are nuanced trade-offs, costs and benefits. However, I also tend to believe that the empirical research in particular has, by narrowing the focus on privacy as protection information, has focused then the investigation on a few narrow questions. Again, there are exceptions, but by and large, the empirical privacy literature is focused on the cost of privacy protection, the cost of privacy regulation. And this is great in a way because we are learning, we want to know those costs, it's important to know, but perhaps we are learning some opportunities. And this is how I frame finally the point where I wanted to get to you. Some of you may have already seen this because I've used it in a couple other talks, but I keep reusing it because it's very important for me to tell the story. Essentially, the story I see currently in the conventional wisdom debate around privacy is that either we get more data or we get more privacy. If we get more data, we have more economic benefits, efficiency, innovation. If we get more privacy, we have more autonomy, dignity, and freedom. And like I said, my claim is that by and large, with exception, most of the economic work is focused on this, on the benefits of data, and by reverse, on the cost in terms of benefits lost, efficiency lost, innovation lost when we have privacy regulation. Okay, But I argue that in reality, there are so many open questions, so many things we don't know when we try to dig a little deeper and challenge the implicit assumptions hidden in this balance, this scale metaphor that I've been using, perhaps a overly simplistic one, but I hope a useful one. What do I mean by many open issues? One is, for instance, that, and here I'm getting closer to answering some of Ginger's very relevant points, is that we have not paid much attention to what happens when we have less privacy, what happens in terms of autonomy, dignity, and freedom. We don't really know very well what are the long-term ramifications of the cost of privacy. And one could say that perhaps, well, it's not the job of the economists, right? Because the job of the economists is to study quantifiable trade-offs rather than important but ethereal concepts such as dignity, freedom, autonomy. But let me see whether I am going to convince you about what the problem is here in the next few slides, which I had promised when I was responding to Ginger. By and large, we focus on things such as how GDPR or CCPA decrease advertising effectiveness, e-commerce revenues, venture capital investment. All good, because we want to know this. We want to have data evidence. But what about these other more subtle ramifications that in lack of privacy protection, we can see situations where the personal searches or personal attacks of women in the United States, especially after the post-Roe, so that after the US Supreme Court decision from now about 3 years ago, they can be used, and they've been used sometimes to prosecute women, put them in prison, because allegedly they were searching for information suggesting that they wanted to have an abortion. What about the impact that if we don't protect data, data can be used for very precise algorithmic influence, which may ultimately affect elections. Now, there is huge debate here in the communication literature, in the computational social science literature, in the political science literature, trying to estimate whether or not the things like Cambridge Analytica did have an effect or not on the elections. There have been works, even by some economists, on the impact that Facebook may or may not have on elections. But the point here is that there are profound ramifications of the usage of data, which reach the level of being macroeconomic, massive ramifications, which are lost when we only focus on privacy as concealment of data and immediate trade-offs. And we have even more massive verifications, such as the usage of data and algorithmic targeting in manners that unintentionally can foster genocidal violence. Facebook commissioned to an independent third party a report on how algorithmic targeting unintentionally, clearly Facebook didn't want this, Facebook engineers did not want this. This algorithmic targeting, which is of course reliant on the collection and usage of personal information, foster ethnic hatred in Myanmar, leading eventually to genocidal violence. So this can be seen as a privacy trade-off in that, or rather, as a set of costs which can be connected to the usage of data for algorithmic targeting. And to me, the argument I'm making is that sometimes in our very precise and sophisticated by narrow view of privacy, I fear we may be risking losing the forest for the tree. And now, again, let's go back to the argument that perhaps, economists should not focus on these things, on genocidal violence or on the effect that the presence or absence of privacy regulation has on women's healthcare, because they are not economic trade-off. But here is the problem, and here is finally the answer I wanted to give to Jane. We often see in our own writings something that is not new that already Richard Posner has started doing essentially over 40 years ago. Earlier, I pointed out the paper by Posner from 1981, AR, but 3 years later, he had published another piece on privacy in 1978, in which he started the piece by saying, I will sidestep the definition of problem of privacy is referring to how to define privacy by simply noting that one aspect of privacy is withholding or concealment of information. Essentially, Posner is saying, I know that there are scholars in other fields looking at privacy differently, but for me, I will focus on one angle, which is withholding and concealment. So he's doing something very careful, right? He's saying, as an economist, yes, I acknowledge that there are other dimensions of privacy, but as an economist, I have to focus on this because this is precise, this I can study, this I can model, right? So going back to the questions I had about how do we model this? So far, so good. There is nothing bad about that. In fact, it's good. It's important that we are precise in how we study the things we want to investigate. But then in the same paper, in the end, there is this line. In the perspective offered by economics and by the common law, the recent legislative emphasis on favoring individuals and denigrating corporate and organizational privacy stands revealed as still another example of perverse government regulation of socioeconomic life. So do you see what is happening here? Essentially, the manuscript starts by saying, as an economist, I'm going to focus on this narrow aspect, even though I know that there are other dimensions of privacy. But then, by the time the manuscript reaches the conclusion, it is as if the manuscript had lost, had forgotten its careful definition at the start, because it says it actually attacks regulation at large, perverse government regulation of socioeconomic life. And what I fear is that unintentionally, we may be risking doing the same, that we are narrowly and rigorously focusing on a certain aspect of privacy, but then in our manuscript, we end up making conclusions about regulation at large without realizing that, economic, directly measurable trade-offs are not the only trade-offs important in privacy. So this was the first problem I have with the literature, and it is my first answer also to Long Chen when he asked me about what do those definitional difference, what practical implications they have on research. Another implication is this, that rather than looking at data and privacy as antagonistic, we want to understand better how often they are antagonistic. And here is all the research that finally started growing in economics after being the domain of computer scientists for about 20 years on privacy-preserving analytics such as differential privacy. I had the honor of presenting at Luohan Academy 2 or 3 years ago, a study on differential privacy. Differential privacy has been controversial among demographers and also some economists, because some demographers have started showing that after the census proposed to use differential privacy, some unintended consequences may arise from the deployment of differential privacy to protect data while also using data. So there is this debate on the unintended consequences that these privacy protection mechanisms could have on the utility of data important to government, important to researchers, etc. And in the study that I presented 2 or 3 years ago here in a webinar, which we published in 2022, we show that yes, those costs exist, but they're actually quite minuscule if you compare them to the costs that actually come from other issues such as data uncertainty. And finally, and again, to address one of the questions I received, how much do we really know about here? That the more data, the correlation between more data, more economic benefits, more innovation, etc. Clearly, we know more data creates benefits, efficiency, innovation. Yes, that we know. But the two key questions that I believe that I would love to see more research on are, do we really believe that when we regulate data, we really lose benefits, efficiency, innovation? That's question number one. Question number two, I'm about to get that in about 3 minutes, but let me focus on question number one, because this allows me to answer a question I don't remember by whom about whether I agree that GDPR was an economic disaster or not. And my answer was no, I don't agree. I agree that it did have economic cost, but I also said that I feel they may have been overblown. What do I mean by this? Because one way one way to study those, the loss of benefits in efficiency and innovation is indeed to take things like natural experiments like GDPR or CCPA, etc., and do diff in diff or use similar methodologies to understand the impact that they have. And many of us have done that. I would like to point out that many of the studies have focused on directly measurable effects, such as loss of advertising effectiveness, rather than downstream effects, such as loss of consumer welfare, and also typically more often than not on short-term metrics, such as what happens in the first year or 2 years after the enactment. I believe that we want more research on the long-term effect and on indirect downstream effects. What do I mean? There is certainly evidence of a cost, economic cost that GDPR caused. We have the largest ones were found in this paper by Johnson and others on the impact of GDPR on the app provision, on the provisions of app. But there are also studies that focus on advertising effectiveness, e-commerce revenues, etc. But there are also studies that point results. That's why I'm saying my answer to the question about GDPR being a disaster, I say no, because in my view, the empirical evidence doesn't go in only one direction. It's much more nuanced than what we may believe. For instance, Vincent Lefreur and others, full disclosure, I am among the et al. Here, so I'm one of the authors, found that when we look at downstream effects, so whether there was a negative impact on, for instance, in this particular case, on the provision of free quality content of news in EU websites related to US websites due to the GDPR, we find none. And why we would have expected to have an effect? Well, because that's exactly what the industry was saying would happen before the GDPR. One of the common criticisms was that GDPR would, by making data collection harder, to make online advertising harder, essentially more costly. This would decrease the ability of content providers to provide content. We find no evidence of that in the GDPR website, in news and media websites. We had another study led by Christopher Scher. Again, I have full disclosure, I am in the et al., in which we instead focus on Apple ATT, application tracking transparency. Once again, very debated, very controversial. Facebook didn't like Apple ATT at all. A number of studies have come out showing the damage the ATT cause. We have a study in which we look at the downstream effect, because ultimately we are interested in consumer wealth. We try to see whether there was a negative effect on the provision of apps on the iTunes ecosystem compared to the Android ecosystem. Again, we find essentially negligible effect, and in fact only temporary one. And in work which is ongoing, we show that some results presented in the literature, which suggested an increasing concentration in the market following privacy regulations. So some papers have suggested privacy regulation as the unintended consequence of making large players even larger, actually may have been a short-term phenomenon. If you look at longer term, you see that the market goes back to pre-GDPR conditions. So this is ongoing, not peer-reviewed, so it's subject to all the possible caveats. If you're interested, ask me. I can offline, I can tell you more about this study. And also, my final point, how much do we know, and the second question, about the allocation of value extracted from data? And this is so relevant nowadays with ChatGPT, LLMs, etc. Because to me, the crucial question that we are not spending enough time is, to the extent that economic values is created from the collection of data, and I do believe it is created, how is that value allocated to different stakeholders? How much does that value end up going to publishers, to consumers versus to intermediaries? And I believe that I will not have time to discuss all of this because I already see I have only 2 minutes left. I believe that there is not enough investigation of consumer benefits from their data being collected. For instance, in one study that we did and we presented at FTC a couple of years ago, we showed that although behavioral targeted ads may indeed decrease search costs, that's what they're meant to do, they actually correlate with higher prices and lower quality vendors for consumers who end up buying from ads behaviorally targeted to them, which I think is very important from the perspective of answering the question, do consumers really benefit from behavior targeted ads? Do consumers benefit in terms of consumer welfare? from the collection and analysis of the data. So what I'm trying to say is that the definitional distinctions that I started my my presentation with do have profound differences, do have profound implications ultimately in terms of what the research question we are focusing on and how we interpret them. The very last, because I realize I've run out of time, the very last two things I want to tell you is we are running an experiment in which we basically assign people to different experimental conditions, baseline of blocking and tracking. We follow their behavior over time. If you're interested in what I'm saying, contact me because we want to make this experiment available to others. But I had to go very fast, and I promise you that I would end up with Richard Posner again, a giant of the econ and law literature, and with another economist, a very, very important economist, Jack Hirschleifer. And I want to end with him because I want to end with this quote. Jack Hirschleifer in 1980s responded to Posner by saying that, our economists, our peerless leaders have discovered the continent of privacy, and they are, in a way, hostile to privacy. But is it possible that they've mistaken a peninsula for the mainland, the foothills for the Grand Sierra, or even perhaps misread their compass so as to reverse north or south? Essentially, Jack Hirschleifer is saying privacy is not just secrecy. Privacy is something more than secrecy. Privacy is about autonomy within society, and perhaps we should pay attention to that in whenever we work on privacy. Sorry for going a couple of minutes late, and thank you very much for your attention and for having me here.
Thank you. Is there any questions?
Yeah, I have actually several comments and maybe questions. So anyway, I'm very happy that Alexandra. So thank you for your presentation, and it kind of stimulated me to think about issues, and especially across the world, and especially in China, we've gone through a lot of the digital business transformation. So, and I'm happy that Ginger and Leon were all here. So let's. I think there are several things it's worthy to be a little bit over time to discuss a little bit. I'm going to describe my view here. Firstly, I'm thinking about GDPR, and I kind of, after I think about it, I kind of agree with Alexandra. So I think about the progress in China versus Europe. I think it's not about the data privacy protection per se. It's just really about in Europe, the digital business is never took off. So privacy protection or not, it's not really the fundamental thing. Because in China, we witnessed that we went through a painful period of the privacy law and the practice change especially after GDPR. But then I think gradually after several years, we see its fruit. But nowadays, people talk much less about privacy things because there's a lot of laws. And a lot of the software applications now, it's assumed that there's privacy protection technology, stuff like that. So I think that after that, it took off. So I think my point here is that it's not about the protection per se that hinders the progress of the digital practice. I think, but it is probably better that the sequence could be the other way around. It's unfortunate for Europe because when in China, it already took off. It's like the efficiency always go before fairness. And when you already took off, then that's fine. But in Europe, it becomes a burden. But otherwise, I don't think GDPR hinders the privacy per se. So that's one thing. I thank Alexander for you to help me think about it. Another thing I want to talk about is the value of data. I think the value of data, it's not certain. It's not specific. It's actually specific to use cases. That's why there's no good data exchange anywhere in China or in the world. In China, there's a lot of policies trying to push for a lot of data exchange. It never succeed. And I think it will never, because it's so volatile, because it's just like AI. I think the value of AI is very use case specific. That's my another point. Finally, I think I think people can be, you talk about people can be manipulated by data, like the related to the election stuff but it seems to me that has nothing to do with privacy. It seems to be that that's another side of the human nature, that is people are very easy to be manipulated through information. And I'm not sure this is direct to the privacy stuff. Anyway, some of the questions for me to say. I'd like to hear you guys comment.
Great comments. I completely agree with points 1 and 2. I respect your point 3. My reason for dragging even the topic under the privacy umbrella is that the manipulation can be weaponized magnified through a collection of personal data and which then can lead to manipulation at scale. So to me, there is a there because data can then allow this manipulation, very precisely fine targeted manipulation at scale. Although I respect your theory as well. Too, I'm completely in agreement.
Yeah, may I follow up along's last point? I think the weaponization of personal information not only require personal information, but also algorithm or whatever data operations that enable this to happen, right? So if we're thinking about the regulation, it seems like we could attack this at the source, say somehow the personal information is not shared, or we can attack this by saying what kind of data operation is not allowed or how we enforce it and so forth. So I wonder how you think about like these two types of data regulation. Maybe they're complements.
Great question, Ginger. You all are asking very good questions and sometimes difficult ones, because Ginger, my answer to your question may have been different depending on whether you are asking 5 months ago. You could argue that, well, we cannot really protect that source. We just have to correct the use. But what if, and I'm talking, hypothetically, I'm not making any reference to anything that may be happening in any part of the world. What if we have large data sets which are already being collected with certain privacy safeguards, and then somehow, because of new elections, there are individuals who originally were not part of the government who get access to those data sets and may not be willing to follow the protections that had been inbuilt through social norms, internal best practices, as well as federal, state government regulation. And they may try to use this data for manners that were not previously expected. That's where the, let's not focus on protected data source, let's protect the usage argument falls down, right? And I'm not saying this is a criticism of yours, because I don't think you were advocating one or the other. I'm simply pointing out the recent developments have shown how risky it is to trust that well, we can no longer protect that source. Let's focus on the usage. How fragile, how frail and fragile that strategy can be, because it can quickly fail under pressure.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, on the other hand, GDPR and the like, they're trying to regulate. They're trying to have teeth on people who respect such regulation and will at least willing to spend some time and effort to comply with it, right? If we're talking about scammers and other totally criminal use, they won't care, like, what do you have written on the privacy regulation? What do you disallow in the sourcing of the data or disallow in the usage of data? They're going to charge ahead with whatever technology enables them. So in that sense, I'm not sure either regulation would have any bite on those, and probably this comes down to enforcement or other things, not just writing the right words on the paper.
Big problem. Thank you, Ginger.
Alessandro, I may have a question too. Tommaso and I am based in Europe. So somehow the idea of the GDPR was to fix a negative externality that the market was not accounting for. So there's too much information going around to the extent that people may not like it, there may be leakages, etc., etc. So this was whether this has succeeded or not, we may discuss about it, but there was this fundamental negative externalities. And then I consider the work done by some economists, empirical work done by some economists, and they do what they can with the available metrics they have. Imagine the number of apps, and they do observe that at the GDPR, there was a decrease, say, in the number of apps compared to some control group. But is this not going exactly in the intended direction of the GDPR? Instead, economists then superimpose on this a standard model without externalities and say, imagine we live in a world where people like variety. And if people like variety, a reduction in variety is bad for consumer surplus. Hence, consumers have lost. But I see a logical leap there, which I don't know. Maybe I'm not familiar enough with the literature, but I think there is a disconnect that people don't recognize. So even observing a reduction in some metric of economic activity, I mean, maybe we did some overshooting. Maybe we regulated too much. We went well above the intended reduction. This I don't know. But is this discussed among economists or not? I see a disconnect. I would like to know your opinion about it.
I feel not often enough. I think it's another great point. Essentially, you're bringing the discussion up to the next layer, pointing out sometimes the axiomatic nature of certain arguments where we assume that, okay, there is a reduction in apps, whether that is true or not is debatable, right? Because I respect very much that particular paper and its authors, but one can, while respecting, also critique the methodology, right? And challenge whether or not the very significant drop that manuscript reported in terms of apps available due to the GDPR, whether that is real or not. But you are bringing up the discussion at the higher level, which is, okay, let's say that the results are actually true. And GDPR caused a 25% drop in one generation of apps. It regained later, but there was this one-time shock. Is it ipso facto? And because Tommaso and I are Italian, I'm going back to using Latin. So is it in and of itself negative? We tend to take it as inherently a negative metrics. Oh, you see, there are fewer apps. There is less variety. This is bad for consumer welfare. I do agree with Tommaso that we should challenge our own assumptions even at that layer. So I have not done that in my talk, other than pointing out that there are other side effects which we often do not study. I do not believe this happening often enough in econ conferences. I've seen that being discussed in legal circles. For instance, folks like Daniel Solov critiquing the immediate interpretation of certain negative metrics as, you see, this is bad. As while it could be, as Tommaso said, this is working as intended. And so I think it's another important.
Okay, I guess that brings us to the end of today's webinar. Thank you, Professor Acquisti, for sharing your views, sincere views and expertise. And thank all of you for your active participation and great questions.